shadow in the forest, and everything became quiet. Quiet, like in a forgotten valley, where neither the wind nor the birds break the stillness. Only the rustle of ancient trees, which seemed to have witnessed neither time nor people. As the sun set, when the last rays of light spread across the sky, leaving it crimson, and in the darkness, the shadows began to rise, this is when the story begins. Since the first snowfall of the season, which had covered the ground, a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains had become the center of strange events. Locals whispered about eerie sounds in the forest surrounding their town. Nighttime cries, resembling the voices of people from a place beyond reality. No one could explain what was happening, but everyone who had heard these sounds never returned to the woods. Ryan Bennett, a 32-year-old detective from Chicago, didn't believe in such superstitions. He was pragmatic and didn't care much for the mystical or supernatural. But this time, he couldn't refuse the case. People were disappearing without a trace. "If you want to solve this, you'll have to be ready for what you're about to see," warned the local sheriff, Thomas Harper, an old man with deep wrinkles on his face that no longer believed in the normal laws of physics. Ryan got into the driver's seat of his SUV and drove along with the sheriff into the forest. The crunch of snow under the wheels was the only sound breaking the silence. As soon as they entered the thick woods, a dense fog began to descend from the mountain, as if enveloping everything around. The air felt unstable, and even the trees lining the road seemed somewhat unfriendly. "This is where we stop," said Thomas, pulling over by an old stone bridge crossing a small stream. "I'm not going any further. Why don't you stay in the car?" Ryan knew he had to go, that the responsibility for solving this case rested on his shoulders. So, he grabbed a flashlight and set off with the sheriff toward the deeper part of the woods. Suddenly, he heard strange noises that seemed to be coming from the dark expanse of the forest. "What's that?" he asked, pointing the flashlight toward the sound. "That's them," replied Thomas, his voice shaking. Ryan couldn't understand who he was talking about, but he could feel the cold creeping into him. They continued walking deeper into the forest until they came upon an old cabin. The windows were boarded up, and the door had long lost its lock. The place looked abandoned. Ryan approached the door, and suddenly, a barely audible voice came from within, not human. Grabbing his rifle, Ryan cautiously opened the door. The inside was dark, and the smell of rot hit him immediately. "What is this place?" he asked, scanning the room, where old furniture stood covered in dust, and strange drawings decorated the walls, resembling images of beings he had never seen before. "I don't know," Thomas said, "but if you want to uncover the truth, you'll have to pay a high price." Just then, behind Ryan, footsteps grew louder. He turned around and saw a figure emerging from the shadows that looked like a human at first glance. But the closer it got, the more it seemed not quite human. Something shifted in the darkness, as if an invisible force was drawing nearer to them. And in that moment, Ryan felt something break inside his mind. He could no longer feel fear, only a profound emptiness. "Don't look into its eyes," whispered Thomas. But Ryan couldn't look away. He was hypnotized, staring into the black eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. And in that moment, something snapped inside him. It was as though something had woken up from a deep slumber. "You're one of us now," whispered the shadow, and its voice echoed in his mind, like the resonance of thousands of voices wandering in eternal darkness. Ryan's face lost its expression, and his fingers trembled. He heard a quiet laugh behind him. When he turned around, he saw Thomas, who now looked like a different being. His eyes were as black as night, and the human expression was gone. Ryan took a few steps back, trying to tear his gaze away from the terrifying darkness that seemed to be swallowing his soul. His breathing became heavy, and every movement was mechanical, as though his consciousness had already left his body. "You won't escape," the whisper came again. "You're already here. With us." And in the next moment, everything around him drowned in darkness. The darkness enveloped everything around him, and Ryan couldn't take his eyes off the approaching figure. He felt his heart pounding like a drum, and every breath grew heavier. The shadow moving toward him was strange. It didn't seem human, but more like an indistinct form that shifted and rippled in the dark, its edges quivering with every movement. "Do you see this?" Ryan whispered, unable to look away. Sheriff Harper, standing next to him, didn't respond. His face had gone ashen, and his eyes were clouded with fear. He stepped back, looking at Ryan as though trying to escape from something that seemed to curse him. The shadow moved closer, then suddenly stopped. It remained still for a few seconds, and those moments seemed endless. Then it slowly began to change its shape, as if it were flowing in weightlessness. Ryan could feel the air around them growing dense, heavy, and with each passing second, the sensation intensified. A strange sound emerged from the darkness, like an intermittent whisper. At first faint, then louder, as though voices were trying to be hidden but couldn't. It seemed to come from deep within the forest, yet it also felt as though it was coming from the very heart of it. Ryan tried to regain his composure, to regain control over his emotions. He felt the cold creeping into his hands, making them tremble, and the sheriff's voice, which seemed incapable of uttering a word, only added to the sense of hopelessness. "What is it?" he asked, looking at the shadow that no longer seemed like just a shadow. It began to move toward them slowly. It no longer resembled a human, but some shapeless form, changing and shimmering in the dark, compressing the space around them. For a moment, for just a second, Ryan saw its eyes, empty black pupils that devoured everything around them, as if the darkness itself had become their vessel. Sheriff Harper quietly, almost inaudibly, said, "She's coming for us." Ryan couldn't say anything in response. His mind refused to accept reality, but in those moments when the shadow drew nearer, he understood one thing: they wouldn't escape. Suddenly, the shadow stopped, and the darkness inside the cabin, where they stood, became dense like a fog. It felt as though even the air had become still, and the silence that settled was so deep that one could hear the beating of their own heart. Thomas Harper, with all his years of experience, only grabbed Ryan's shoulders and squeezed them tightly, as though trying to pass on some vital truth. "Don't look into her eyes," he whispered. But Ryan couldn't pull away. He was drawn in, as though hypnotized, staring into those black eyes that seemed to consume him, and in that instant, something broke within him. His breath grew shallow, his body frozen, as if his soul was slipping away into that abyss. "You are one of us now," the shadow whispered again, its voice cold and hollow. And as the shadow moved closer, Ryan felt himself falling, his mind slipping away, until everything dissolved into complete darkness.